Gender equality is not just a fundamental human right, but it is a foundation for a peaceful, a prosperous, and a sustainable world. Research has consistently shown us that societies thrive best when women and girls are given equal opportunities to succeed. So SDG 5 addresses key areas, including discrimination and violence against women, and ensuring equal participation in key areas like leadership, and most importantly for today's discussion, providing equal access to economic resources. In addressing SDG 5, we are specifically addressing Target 5.A of SDG 5, which seeks to say that we are undertaking reforms to give women equal rights to economic resources, as well as access to ownership and control over land and other forms of property, financial services, so whether that means loans from the bank, inheritance, and national resources by national laws. The importance of this target cannot be overstated. Economic empowerment is a critical factor in reducing GBV, gender-based violence, and ensuring that women can live dignified lives, and that on top of living dignified lives, they live independent lives. In Uganda, the situation regarding equitable access to resources, like very many of you know, is a very sad reality. The Uganda Bureau of Statistics shows that only 27% of women own land, as opposed or compared to 47% of men. Financial services and access to financial services also shows that there is a gender gap, with over 50% of women having access to a bank account as compared to 67% of men. These disparities extend to areas such as inheritance rights, where there are cultural and legal barriers which often prevent women from inheriting. So you might be wondering, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, Omega, I can hear you.
Right now, you can?
I can hear as well.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. Welcome to today's crucial webinar on an appraisal of Target 5 of Sustainable Development Goal 5. My name is Lillian Achola, and I serve here at FIDA Uganda as the Communications Officer. I'm deeply honored to be your host for today's conversation, and once again, thank you for making the time to be with us. Our advocacy manager, Miss Elizabeth Kemigisha, is en route from Nairobi, but the moment she gets space during the transit, she's going to give closing remarks for this webinar. So to start, as we are talking about the SDGs and targets, it's very crucial to remind ourselves what is the broader vision behind the Sustainable Development Goals. Adopted by the United Nations member states in 2015, they represent a universal call to end poverty, to protect our planet, and ensure peace and prosperity for all by 2030. These 17 interconnected goals, they're designed to leave no one behind. So whether that looks like addressing critical areas like health, education, inequality, and economic growth, while tackling new emerging areas and important critical areas like climate change and the preservation of our forests and oceans. In this particular webinar today, we are going to focus on Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is dedicated to achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. Gender equality is not just a fundamental human right, but it is a foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. Research, like very many of you know, say Mr. Jonathan, who has deeply done work in land rights, it shows that societies thrive when women and girls are given equal opportunities to succeed. And this SDG 5 that we are looking at today, it's addressing key areas, including ending discrimination, violence against women, equal participation in leadership, and most importantly for today's conversation, providing equal access to economic resources. And in this particular conversation today, we're going to focus on SDG 5, but in particular, target 5.A. And target 5.A states, undertake reforms to give economic resources as well as access to ownership and control over land and other forms of property, financial services, inheritance, natural resources, and national laws. Each of those words in that target is going to be an extremely important component of our conversation. The importance of this target, like very many of you just by hearing it, we cannot overstress it, because economic empowerment is a critical factor in reducing GBV and in ensuring that women lead dignified and independent lives. In Uganda, the statistics that Uganda Bureau of Statistics give us, they are extremely sad. We see that women own only 27% of land as compared to 47% of men. Financial services and access to financial services, there is also a gap there, with women owning 50% of bank accounts or having bank accounts at 50%, whereas men have 67% of bank accounts. These disparities, they don't stop just there on land ownership and having access to a bank account. They have implications and they manifest themselves in very many other different ways. For example, through inheritance rights that propel culture and religious and legal barriers. And it is extremely important to note that these inequalities have profound consequences. The lack of economic resources and financial independence makes women more vulnerable to gender-based violence. So the question that would come up in this webinar is, why are we discussing land and how does it affect a woman's peace, or even how does it relate to gender-based violence? So you're going to clearly see through this webinar that women who do not have control over economic resources are often trapped in abusive relationships where they lack the means to support themselves. There is a deep critical intersection between economic rights and gender-based violence, and that is why organizations like FIDA Uganda have come into play to organize webinars such as this. FIDA Uganda has been a staunch advocate for women's rights since its establishment in 1974. As we celebrate 50 years, we shall continue to create spaces such as this to talk about issues that are as important as this. So whether it has been through legal aid, whether it has been through advocacy, whether it has been through policy influence, we have worked tirelessly to influence women and children in Uganda and make sure that they have access to justice. Today, as we discuss SDG 5 and that particular target on equitable access to resources, we are deeply fortunate to have two distinguished speakers with us today who will guide us in this important discussion. We have Miss Lillian Achola, and she will introduce herself much more later on. And we have Mr. Jonathan Ochom. Miss Lillian Achola, I can just give just a little introduction. She's a seasoned lawyer and she's a human rights advocate with extensive experience in gender equality and women's rights. She has worked hard. She will give us her background at LandNet and the work that she has done. But you need to be at peace knowing that if there is a conversation on women's land rights, we are just with the right person. Mr. Jonathan Achola is a renowned legal expert and researcher specializing in land and property rights. He has a strong background in public policy and a steadfast commitment to social justice. He has significantly contributed to discourse on land reform and equitable access to resources in Uganda. His insights in today's particular conversation will give us an understanding of both the legal and the practical aspects when we are talking about equitable access to resources. So it is not enough to just talk about the legal, what is on paper. As human rights advocates and as people that are advancing women's rights in every sector, we need to know what are those practical aspects that could either propel our work or that could make things extremely difficult and hinder the realization of women's rights. Together, and as a joint team, these two individuals and these two leaders and thought leaders in this field, they bring a wealth of knowledge, they bring a wealth of experience, they bring deep commitment to this topic, and we're extremely honored to have them today. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our speakers. Miss Lillian Achola, I think you can come first. and just give a brief introduction and say hello to our audience. And then Mr. Jonathan, you can say hello too.
Thank you, Madam Aloyo. I'm Lillian Achola and I work with Land at Uganda. I have worked in the land sector for over 14 years, working on land administration, women land rights and policy. And I work with Land at Uganda. Thank you.
Mr. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Omega. When you're introducing me, I kept looking at myself and wondering if you're actually describing me, because that was quite an advert. Eh? Thank you. Thank you for your kind remarks. My name is Jonathan Ochom. I currently work at Transparency International Secretariat as a land governance thematic specialist, but I've been in Uganda's land space for a decade now, and probably a few months there. I'm glad to be here. Whenever I'm in a feeder meeting, I'm always the minority, because I see on the call I could be the only male, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, all the same, I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
You're not a minority. As long as your heart is in the right place, you're really with us in the majority. As we embark on this discussion, I want to encourage our audience and our participants that have made the time to join us today. Please engage actively. You can see, maybe Ms. Lillian has not mentioned, but she's the executive director at LandNet. We have these two individuals that are ready to answer questions, that are ready to learn with us. So please engage actively. If you have a question, ask. It will be answered. So without any further ado, allow us to begin. And I will start with Mr. Jonathan. When we talk about the appraisal of Target 5, SDG 5, in as far as access to equal resources or equal access to resources goes, how do you describe Uganda's land regime in line with respect to women's rights right now? So if the date is the 14th of June 2024, as of right now, how would you describe our land regime? And as you answer this question, we just want to hear, of course, there are so many laws, whether those laws are national, whatever they're governing, whether they're governing marriages, whether they're governing land, whether it is in the community, whether it is IT, the information systems, whether it is court. What are those laws? What is our land regime? What does it look like from a 360 perspective? What does our land regime look like? What are the changes? Are they good? Are we seeing any impact if the government has invested, if Parliament has invested in coming up with all these initiatives? Are we seeing any impact or any positive return on them?
All right, thank you so much, Omega. That's quite a mouthful of questions, but hopefully I'll be able to skim through them. I normally, like starting my conversations with the foundational issues, that when we talk about laws or legal regimes, laws are, by all standards, a reflection of the predominant views in a given society. So what that means is that when a law is put in place, oftentimes it's about enforcing existing belief systems, it's about validating existing assumptions, the popular narratives or conceptions on a particular issue, and oftentimes it takes the angle of what the majority feel is correct. Whether that is fair or not could be another issue. So when you come to our context of Uganda, where we are predominantly an agrarian society, by that I mean we basically just grow crops and keep a few animals here and there for survival. We engaged in subsistence agriculture. I think the average farm size in Uganda is about 3 acres, and that's almost pretty much the situation in across Africa. And there's a very interesting dynamic there that, in as far as agriculture is concerned, then the predominant labor force is actually provided by women. Those are some of the figures from FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. Now, given that background, that we are an agrarian society, but also patriarchal in nature. Male dominance, basically runs the day. That simply means that when you talk about land is one of those areas in which power relations tend to be manifested. For example, how do we determine the different interests on land, the different rights on land? When you talk about rights on land, you're talking about access, use, ownership, disposal rights. Those rights are framed based on the existing power relations in a given society. So that means that when you look at our land laws in Uganda, they are inherently informed by that context that we come from as a country. And so looking at progressive laws, like the Constitution and the Land Act, there's the deliberate focus at redressing inequality, that especially gender inequality, which has literally defined Uganda since its inception. And at like they say, everywhere you go to, Uganda is good at, making good laws. And I think that is my assessment that yes, where we are now, I think generally I would say that we have good laws because our constitution, reflects all the global standards on property rights, provides for equality, provides for the right to own property. It is even a little bit more radical, vets land into the people, which is not the case in many parts of the society. I mean, rather, not in many parts of the world. But at the same time, it's also important to note that issues of gender relations on land are not restricted to only land laws because land is an issue of property. So it's a social issue. It then also comes into play with the marriage and divorce laws. It has a linkage to inheritance, succession and inheritance laws. So there's that whole bundle of laws that accompany what we call land laws in Uganda. So when you speak about women's land rights, we can argue, or rather I can describe the current system as generally progressive. Progressive in terms that it provides, it meets the basic global human rights standards. It recognizes equality, provides affirmative action, it's in the Constitution. The Land Act has specific provisions that speak to women's rights, that forbid marginalization, that provide quotas for women in all the land governance institutions. So I would broadly say that the legal framework as it is now is by and large progressive. And maybe at a later point, we can then discuss what are the challenges. But for now, going by the question you asked me, I would say my description would be that the legal system is by and large a progressive one, probably among the best in the region because it conforms to established international human rights law standards. Thank you, Omega.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Jonathan. And we can see that the legal regime and the legal system really does cover for land ownership in as far as women's rights are concerned. So whether it is through the Constitution, the Land Act, and different laws and policies that are in place to make sure that women have land rights. But one thing that you mentioned that was really critical was that land is a social issue. It is not just the land that we step on and the land that we till. It is something that is governed by the social nature of a particular community. So how that community relates culturally, if patriarchy is at the helm of that community, then it is going to reflect in the land governance of that particular community. And now coming to you, Ms. Lillian, Mr. Jonathan stated that our legal framework, it's liberal. It even goes as far as giving land ownership to the citizens. But we know that, like he said, it is a social issue. And I know that you have worked on revolutionary projects such as the formation of the first communal land association, and you've done extensive advocacy on the establishment of a customary land registry. And the reason we bring this up is because we know of the different land tenure systems in Uganda. We know you can own land, whether it is through freehold, whether it is through customary, whether it is through the different ways you can own it via the constitution. But on all these initiatives that you've worked on, they speak to one word, community. And my question to you right now is, how important is it to put the community at the forefront of land reform interventions? Because we have the laws in place, we have the policies in place, but you find an organization like LandNet going as far as to say, okay, how do we come up with the first communal land association? How do we sort of find a way to tune in community into this conversation? And as you answer that question, another question comes up. What is the effect of not having the community at the forefront of such interventions? Have we lost Lillian?
No, I'm there. Thank you, Omega. When you look at a community, I think a community comprises of several people that live in that specific community, and they are critical key stakeholders when we are implementing any project or initiative by government. They are very key to us, or key beneficiaries, I must say. And why we involve community, they are the people that are the majority. The policymakers are few. The policymakers make the laws in order for the communities to live in a safe place. So we deal mainly with the communities to get their views, and their views are the ones that inform the laws that we are going to make. Why community is very critical, that if you come up with an initiative whereby you don't have a community involvement in it, say even a law where you don't do consultations with the community, trust me, it may not work out. Implementation may become hard for you, and you may not really achieve the results that you would want to see. Or if it's a law reform, the community has to be part of those law reforms. They should feel that we are making this law, this is what we want as a community. So communities are very critical when we come to such issues.
All right then, and just before we go to the next question, there have been a number of laws that have been recently passed, say for instance, the Succession Amendment Act. And just to get your thoughts on those two particular laws, what were the wins in as far as women's rights are concerned, and what are those areas that you feel could have leapt into that act and made way for a more progressive access to resources for women?
The Succession Amendment Act 2022 that was passed, that is now an act right now. One of the issues that I could point out in that act, we all remember that the previous act was kind of discriminatory in nature. And we had issues whereby our hair was male. And in this current law, we are seeing shift of things. We are seeing that a male can be a male or a female. It's no longer a male only regarded as a hair. So we can have a female who is a hair and a male who is a hair, depending on your family background, on what they have decided to choose. So we don't have that connotation of a hair has to be a male. So that is a plus on that other side. When it comes to the issues of customary hair, we all know customary hairs have given a burden to the widows, to the estate that is left behind. They mismanage the estate, and at times even drive away the widows, and the widows are left landless, yet they have a right to that property. At times they're only left with access, yet they should have full control and use of that property. So that is a win on our side as women advocates, that we see that the rights of the heir are kind of explicit in the act, and they're kind of reduced, and his power is reduced, unlike before where they had too much power. And in that same act, we are now trying to tag a punishment to any heir that could go against the law, and that is a plus in the Succession Act. We also have the percentage for a spouse. In case of divorce, you get 20%. That is also a plus. However, we didn't want it that way. We wanted to share 50-50 because we both contribute to that. So if my husband passes on, I'm able to get the other 50, or he also takes 50 in case we divide the property. But that didn't go well. And at least we're able to have a 20%, which is not really that bad. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And as you share those particular statistics with us, the Constitution under Article 21 still talks about equality, but you can see that 50-50% that you're talking about, it's just a reflection of the lack of equitable access to what? To resources. And as we go into the second question, which is, what would you say are the major milestones in terms of land reform? And on this particular question, once again, I'll start with Jonathan Ochom. By now, in this particular webinar, you can tell that land is central to human development, because when women have access to land, they have access to land to till, they have access to financial services, they have access to change their lives. It is a resource in itself, and the beauty about it is the resource that keeps what? Giving. So what are those milestones that you see? And we've seen on the previous Heroes Day, I remember the minister was giving out Milo land certificates, right?
Yeah.
To impoverished people. Was it in Gomba? I think it was in Gomba. That's where Heroes Day was celebrated. But you can see those. And for me, what that brought out for me was some sort of community-based land certification, that it is moving away from the Kampala district offices and that whole centralized system, and rather looking at community initiatives. So what would you say are those major milestones in as far as productivity, that certification, microfinance goes? Yeah.
Thank you, Omega. I think if you walk a little bit back into the whole sort of journey of land reforms in Uganda, there's something worth celebrating. Of course, land reforms trace back to 1900, if I may, but I think we can leave that and maybe focus more on I noticed many people on this call were not born in 1900, so maybe let's focus more on the post 1986 arrangements. First, understanding land reforms. Land reforms are about changing laws, regulations, or customs on land, and most times they are government-led. Of course, there are initiatives that can be done by non-state actors. So, for example, when Buganda Land was started issuing Chapa Mungalo, you could argue that it was a land reform, but it wasn't like a government-led reform. But oftentimes, land reforms are government-led, and they seek to address particular issues. So it could be about social justice, it could be about increasing productivity of land, it could be about redistribution of land, it could be about planning, organizing societies. I mean, you guys, we've always had this discussion around the Physical Planning Act, where they say that, which declare the entire country as a planning zone. That is a land reform, because before that, you could literally use your land in whichever way you want, but now government sort of has taken over the core planning function. And so over the years, we've had several reforms. 1975 was a very radical reform, which basically declared all land to be public, and that was applicable up until 1986. You could even argue like up until 1995, because it was in 1995 when we got a constitution, a new constitution that reversed the 1975 land reform decree. But you know, the constitution brought in the provisions around affirmative action, brought the Bill of Rights, among other things. In 1998, we had the Land Act, which was, I think, operationalizing the provisions of the Constitution. So it was also a very progressive legislation. But in the context of women's land rights, I think the biggest milestone we got was in 2004 and the 2010 amendment that, you know, provided for security of occupancy on land, but also introduced the requirement for spousal consent on family land. I remember I was a little bit young by then, 2004, but that was probably one of the most contentious land reforms in the country, especially, you know, looking at the fact that men, you know, who historically have always had their leeway in terms of land, we're now being told that if you're dealing with family land and the act went ahead to define what family land is, you need the consent of your spouse before you do that transaction. And it's been, you know, quite a successful reform in my view, because these days everybody, first of all, they develop the land regulations that have the forms that have a form for spousal consent. You cannot go to a bank without that signed off. And the bank will be asking you, have all the relevant people, you know, consented to this transaction, which I think really has in one way or the other supported in entrenching the culture of respecting the rights of women, because oftentimes, I'll say women, because oftentimes it's the men that are selling. I know there are many rich women as well who would require the consent of their husbands, but if you go by the ordinary Ugandan setup, it's oftentimes men that are engaged in these transactions. We also had a good reform in 2006 when they passed the Local Council Courts Act, because the Local Council Courts Act has an express mandate on handling matters of a civil nature arising out of customary law, and there's even an express provision on dealing with land-related matters. Why that is important? Because local council courts are a community-based structure, and women have designated slots within those structures. So in a way, you could argue that it also provided an opportunity for women to be engaged in land governance, especially in land dispute resolution. And then, of course, we had the National Land Policy that came in 2013. The National Land Policy is important as well, because policies essentially give you an indication of what government's aspirations are and their priorities are. Unfortunately, policies do not have a force of law. However, they inform the law. So we have quite a progressive National Land Policy. Unfortunately, it expired last year and is under review now. But I hope even the new one that they're working on will probably contain relevant provisions that I think should be able to inform advocacy of people like organizations like FIDA, the landlords of this world, because it they summarize government's own aspirations on particular issues. And then, of course, the things that Lillian talked about, the Succession Act, which I think also was an important law. So I think those have been the major milestones in the land sector. In 2000, I think in 2014, 12 or 14, no, I think 13 or 14, they developed the land sector strategic plan. If you look at the land sector strategic plan, it was a way of operationalizing the national land policy. So some of these ideas you're seeing that they're issuing certificates of customary ownership, they're decentralizing land service provision. Those are ideas that were picked in the land sector strategic plan. So government has now moved on to establish ministerial zonal offices. The last time I checked, there were 23. So that means that a person in as far as Arua doesn't have to come to Entebbe to process the title, because they can get it in the ministerial zonal office. They're in Gulu, they're in Mbale, Soroti, like all the major cities across the country, which I think also has been an important milestone because then it has made access to land services nearer the people. And you could argue from a women's rights angle that if a woman needs to access land services, it is much easier for her than it would have been 20 years ago or 10 years ago if she had to come to Entebbe. And given the economic dynamics in our country, chances are maybe, they could have little money compared to the men. So the men would easily access the services given their financial muscle, and that would leave out majority of women. So having some of the services pushed closer to the communities have been, I think, very important milestones that we can leverage, to push further the gospel of strengthening women's land rights in Uganda. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jonathan, for that very detailed response. And as you kept on sharing, something that kept coming back for me is you cannot talk about target 5 on equitable access to resources without separating it from the question of gender equality. And just like you mentioned that we have those changes that were brought in 2004 regarding spousal consent. So something like spousal consent, we have very many people on this call that may not exactly find the link between the two. So for them, target 5 may be completely disjointed from gender equality and from progress. But for me, something that kept coming back to me is you have a constitution that says you have the right to be equal, right? You have a constitution that says you have the right to own property. Whether you own that property individually or whether you own it jointly, like married people do, is up to you. It is a constitutional provision. It is something that the constitution has given you. But then, just like you mentioned, security of occupancy, right? You find that when one spouse passes on, the scales are tipped. So people that in the constitution have the right to own property, either individually or jointly, things change when there is a separation, and it is that separation is affecting now the widow. Or you have a constitutional provision that says you have equal rights at marriage, during the marriage, or at its dissolution. So the point that truly comes across is that we cannot underestimate policy reform. It has a way of changing things completely for the most vulnerable person. So a provision like spousal consent, if you get it and you attach it to a widow in a place, say like Nakapi Repeat or wherever, it changes the rest of the course of her life. And there was a study that was done, we shall post it in that search, not by us, but it is just a piece of work that shows the link between, widows, their land rights, going in as far as showing the link between those two and HIV, because when they do not have these land rights, they are forced to get into other forms of income generating activities, and then they are exposed to HIV. And if you don't have access to land, like we have been reiterating, you don't have access to microfinance, you don't have access to employment, you don't have any form of livelihood. Like you stated at the beginning of this webinar, we are an agrarian society. We rely on agriculture and in the most basic form. So for me, your presentation really shows why policy reform is something we cannot undermine, that this policy reform, and it is indeed progressive policy reform on this particular target, those are extremely gender sensitive provisions, even demystifying it and bringing it down to the local council courts. But now we come to Ms. Lillian, and as we speak about the major milestones, we would like to hear from you, Ms. Lillian, on the side of court and the legal system and the judicature. What trends are we seeing the courts adopting in the way that they are handling cases? What are those trends that are leaning more towards a gender sensitive, equitable to access to resources sort of style of adjudication of cases? So how are the courts, say, if we were doing an appraisal of target 5, like we are doing now, if you were to appraise the courts, what would you say that, okay, this has been extremely progressive in the way these cases are handled, and here, maybe this needs to change? Yes, please.
Thank you, Omega. as regards to the courts when it comes to gender responsiveness, we give thanks to UN Women. UN Women deliberately trained all the judicial officers, most of them in regards to issues to gender. And with that, they're able to approach legal matters, conflicts, cases that come before them with that gender lens. But when it comes to land matters, given the fact that the men are the ones that own majority, and we have few women, though the numbers are kind of increasing because of the progressive laws that we are having, the advocacy that is being carried out, we are seeing now women registering in their names, a woman having a title in her names compared to way before, when they will become witnesses instead. And when they are able, when they go to court, it becomes quite a little hard for the judicial officials to ensure that justice is accorded to that woman. But right now what we see that all land cases that are being handled, or any other case that is being handled by the judicial officers, they try to use that gender lens angle in it. And we are seeing fruits out of it, where women are winning such cases. An example, we had a case in Moroto, and this lady was disposed of her land. And all the male counterparts, there were roughly like 10 of them, but this woman fought the battle until when she won the case. So, but what made her win the case? Because the judicial officer that was handling her case was able to look at it at that genderless angle. So that is one achievement to that we are seeing that the judicial system kind of changing on a way in how it addresses conflicts or cases before them. Secondly, the other challenge maybe could be when we have the traditional leaders. The traditional leaders still are kind of fixed into the customs and the norms. Though we see that traditional leaders do mediation, help in resolving conflicts, and that is the safest way because it's cheap, it's flexible, and all that. But we shouldn't forget that they're also custodians of those traditional norms and customs and all that. So when a woman gets before them and all that, the kind of judgments that come out at times are not in that angle, in a gender responsive angle. So they kind of lose out. But with the continuous engagement of traditional leaders by different actors in different parts of the country, in different projects, we are seeing that the traditional leaders are also becoming gender, not all of them, because when it comes to customs and norms, that is something that we cannot wipe in just a minute or in a microsecond. It takes years because it touches to attitudes, mindset. It's very hard to wipe it out in a short period of time. But at least we are seeing a slight progress towards that.
All right, then thank you so much, Lillian, for that very comprehensive response. And as you were sharing with us that particular example from the communities, I just remembered that case of Best Kemugisha, the Queen of Toro, I think. So Best Kemugisha versus Mebo Komutale. And in that particular case, as we discussed the whole question around the courts and how gender sensitive are they right now, that particular case, as we talk about Target 5 on equitable access to resources, it was such a landmark case, in my opinion, because it had a queen that was a woman that married, say, into a kingdom, and now she has become a widow. which happens to very many women in Uganda, and she's trying to access the properties of her late husband, and she's a legal wife, which we shall get into much later on. And you have the courts clearly coming out and pronouncing themselves and saying that, yes, much as Toro Kingdom may have their customary laws, the constitution must be placed at the forefront and ensure that this lady has proper access to resources that are constitutionally under her domain. So if the constitution says she has the right to own property in marriage, and those properties belong to them in that particular union, so the courts, we have seen the courts take on a more progressive approach, because in just that one case, you see so many aspects tagging at each other. You see the question of widows. What happens when a widow is, when that particular sad state has come upon her? Is she left to the dogs, or does she have remedy under the courts? And courts, in that particular case, the court came out and said that, you know what, these are women, and under the constitution, they have equal rights as men, right? Whether it is in marriage, at its dissolution, like we previously talked about, we have the question of culture that came out so strongly to adjudicate such a case of its magnitude, and to see that it was a whole queen of a cultural institution, and to see the court actually come out and pronounce itself and choose to go the legal route was a very big win for us as women's rights activists and as people that care about gender inequality. And so for me, as you were speaking, that is something that really came out. So again, we'll keep reiterating that land is a social issue. When the judicature and different arms of government, like Jonathan previously said, reforms come from government, they're supposed to be implemented by government, and the judicature is an arm of the state. So when we look at it from this 360 perspective, that yes, the parliament is putting in place these laws, yes, CSOs are looking for some sort of community-based approach, yes, the judicature is also, you know, the parliament is putting in place the laws, but the judicature is actually running with them and ensuring that if it is a question of equality, then equality is prevailing. If it is a question of proper division of property at the dissolution of marriage, in whatever way that dissolution happens, then we are truly having wins for equitable access to resources. But now we're going to question 3 for our esteemed panelists. And this question concerns what are the concerns, right, about the land regime rights in Uganda, especially for women now, because we have clearly seen that you cannot talk about equitable access to resources for a country that is agrarian and separate land. That is why you'll find that in this particular webinar, we spoke about our resource right now. It seems like in the webinar, we are focusing just on land, but if you understand the magnitude for our participants, the magnitude of what land means to women in Uganda, with the current state of women, with the current state of gender inequality, with the current state of educational gaps, with the current state of poverty, then you'll see why this particular webinar was tailored in such a way that the equitable access to resources is riding a little bit more on land, because the rest of the resources can be so intricately linked to that land and its equitable ownership. So we'll start with Mr. Jonathan once again. What are the major challenges about the land regime rights right now, as of today is the what? As of this day of June 2024? Is it culture? Because we've seen culture coming up very many times, and just again referencing to that best Kemigisha case, you see culture going to the court of law. That is how strong culture is, that it can actually go into, culture can actually stand head to head with the constitution. So what is the concern? Is it culture? Is it access to financial resources? What are those concerns that make it difficult for this country to achieve target 5?
Thank you, Omega. There are quite a number of concerns. I'll start with what I would call the historical issues. The whole gender equality movement in Uganda, whole discussions around, gender equality, in Uganda, and you guys are the experts in this, if I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong. I think that the gender equality discourse in Uganda was introduced from a political lens, from the angle of governance, of public participation in public affairs. It wasn't given the economic angle to sort of demonstrate what added value it would bring into the country, into the economy. So I think the first resistance we get, the first concern we get is that enforcement of laws related to women's land rights, and I could say broadly gender equality, has been reduced to more of a checkbox exercise, like tick a box. The law says have this, tick a box, but it's not driven by values that I understand the importance of my wife having secure land rights. It's from the angle of like, if I can find a way of dodging it, well and good, but if I can't, okay, I'll find a way of playing with it. So it's not coming in from a good place, I think, for many people, and unfortunately, I'll say perhaps for many men, for parts of this conversation. And tying that, if you ask me what causes that, I'll tie that to the issue raised about regressive social and cultural norms. So the discussion on women's land rights is a fight between legality and legitimacy. So we package it from a legal angle and spend a lot of time enacting laws and policies that support this issue, which is excellent. But remember, laws are, for many cultures, you'd say that laws are packaged or are viewed as imperialistic, like they've come to destroy what we've believed in for the rest of our life since we were born. So it reformist laws so inherently meet a certain degree of resistance because they come to upset the status quo. So enforcing, therefore, laws on women's land rights, however good they are, generally find a challenge with, I would call it, natural resistance from those that are meant to comply. So people will always find a way of shortcuts around it or just frustrating its enforcement, and that can really be tied to what we have known all our lives, that land belongs to men. Men make the decisions on land. Women just, tag along, or their interests are tied to my interests as a man. So there's a lot of transformation that we need to do. The other is that even when the laws are good, I consider them more to have packages of tokenism in them. So, for example, very brilliant idea, let's reserve a third of the slots in all land governance institutions for women. So you'll find that every area land committee has at least one woman. You'll find that every district land board has a slot that is reserved for them. The Uganda Land Commission, local council courts, all of them have the designated slots. To show you that people do not necessarily take this issue seriously is the fact that where they say a third, at least a third will be women. Chances are you'll find that the exact number will be a third. It's rare to find a scenario where women actually exceed the quota that is prescribed, the minimum quota prescribed in the law. And that ties back to my earlier point that it's really about ticking a box. The second concern tied to that point is around also the quality of people appointed. To be fair, you go to a community and then you look at, the people that they designate. So, for example, if they say a third of the members shall be women, it's rare to find a situation where you can comfortably say that they've selected the best of the best, the creme de la creme of the society to sit on that particular organ. oftentimes you'll find that these elections are done by most likely men. Chances are they would prefer to have somebody who will come and, just say yes, come and endorse whatever the majority will say. Because if women took their rightful position in these organs, why would we be having some of these questionable land transactions? And you would ordinarily think that, okay, if a lady sat on that committee that made this decision, chances are they would have opposed it. She would have opposed such a measure. But because oftentimes they may not necessarily get the best of the best to represent the women's voice in these organs, so it becomes a little bit self-defeating. And still in relation to even women's participation in this decision-making on land, last week we've been in Uganda, they've been having the Land Learning Week. I was looking at the pictures. On the opening ceremony, there was the vice president, she's a lady. The closing ceremony was the prime minister, she's a lady. The speaker of parliament is a lady. The minister of lands is a lady. The minister of gender is a lady. And sometimes I ask myself, these should be people naturally pushing some of these agendas. But you and I can debate on how effective some of the people that we think would push our agenda, how this has been effective over the years. So I think that as up until now, maybe there's not much convincing evidence that even the people who have sort of entrusted to make some of decisions to protect women's rights are actually up to task. I am aware that there could be many factors that influence people's ability to deliver on their mandate, but I also think that maybe broadly as a society, we've not had the best representation of women within the spaces that would ensure enforcement of these laws. And the other, maybe the last one for me, is the issue of limited infrastructure to enforce and monitor compliance with women's land rights. When we talk about protecting the rights of, say, wives, women, you have land, you have a land registry, you have a marriage registry, NERA has a registry for birth and death and for persons, whatever. This infrastructure is not interlinked. So for example, if I went and I told people that I am not married, I want to sell this land, how would the registrar know that I'm married? Like, how would they object to that decision? He or she object to my decision to sell that property. If when I was buying, I did indicate that I was married, and now that I'm disposing it, or I'm married after, but now I want to deal away with this property. There is no infrastructure that can make it very simple by just a click for a land governance decision maker to say, I think you're lying here. We need to cross-check this. Can you, confirm that you're either married or not? So as a country, we've not invested in putting in place the relevant mechanisms, the relevant structures that would actually enable us to realize, enforce women's land rights, and of course, by necessary implication, realize gender equality. And lastly, which is a slightly, maybe slightly controversial, but maybe I'll still say that the whole discussion, sometimes your enemy can determine how people view you. One of the things that has, I think, frustrated the efforts of attaining women's land rights is the fact that it has been packaged as an elite issue, that it is the omegas of this world, the educated women, who are fighting who want to overthrow men. Like you get branded by your opponent in what you are not. Because honestly, when we talk about women's land rights, we're not talking about you ladies on this call. You're in a better place to protect yourselves. But we're talking about the ordinary woman deep down in Teso, Choli, Buganda, across the country. But then you find people thinking that it's an elite issue. So in a way, even the people that you're actually working for might not be very convinced with your agenda. So there's sort of a lot of work in reshaping some of these negative narratives that have been created around women's land rights, and I think it's going to be where a bit of investment needs to be done as we move forward with this work. Thank you.
All right then, Jonathan, thank you so much for bringing all those issues to light. And as you were speaking, I was just reflecting and thinking to myself, the question of how gender equality has been packaged and how you spoke about it as ticking just a political checkbox. But gender equality is not just for the books. It is something that, if it is indeed checked, it actually penetrates down to the layman or to the woman down there that is working so hard. And even on this call, as we have these different conversations in these spaces, there is a way they trickle down, and how it is not just merely a checkbox, but gender equality is a prosperity propeller. In my own two little words, it is the only way to propel prosperity. Because if you're in a country where, like you said, an agrarian country, right? Women are producing 70% of the food crops, and yet they own only 27% of the land. If we gave that particular production force the equitable access to the resource that is land that they need to expand, if they have land, they can have access again to microfinance to expand. That means that their production is not going to stop at food crops. It is going to go to cash crops. They're going to become business women. There is going to be better access to education. There is going to be, it all fits. It's like an unraveling little, you know, when those theater at the circus, when a man puts, it's like a little handkerchief in his mouth and is pulling it, that never seems to end. That is what that gender perspective is in relation to equitable access to resources. So even as we were reflecting on the third, on those area land committees, and this debate, it doesn't even just come up in only land spaces. It is a very heated debate in the field of affirmative action, because people come up and say that why this? They pull out all the statistics and say, why affirmative action? No, it is no longer relevant. It is not. But even in these third area land committees, and as you mentioned, that statistic and said, if you go to the area land committees, you will find that indeed it is just the third. So for me, something that brings out is how dire is the situation that if you say a third, then it will truly be a third. There will be no option to increase that a third. So usually when you say it is at least a third, you've sort of opened a gate, right? You've opened a gate for, oh, we have our third, let us come in. But you've said a third, and it is strictly a third. So how deep are those cultural norms, and how deep are those hindrances that if you make provision for an opening for women to have agency in questions of equitable land resources, in questions of decision making, that you get just exactly that number, then that poses a serious challenge. And even with the information systems, right? We have that whole, what is it called? Just to be accurate about it, that whole Uganda National Land Information System, and you know it's doing all this. It's branded as to do work on valuation. It's branded as to do work on planning, on registration. But how feasible is such a system in a country that has a 27% internet penetration rate? And if that 27% internet penetration rate is just situated among the participants of this score, then those are really some of those challenges that truly come out. But for me, the key takeaway has been that gender equality is not just something to tick on the box, that it has been reflected in the law. It is something that we must say, if it has been reflected in the law, in what other areas is it going to be choked? Is it in community and cultural hindrances? Is it in any different way that it can be choked, because you have to, if truly you say that towards gender equality, then we should not even be having this webinar on equitable access to resources, because the word equitable at the beginning just shows that there is a contradiction, right? Between the law and what we are seeing on paper. We are just back and forth. So for me, that has been my key takeaway from your presentation, that it is not something just to tick off, and for all the people on this call, it is not something to make reference to in the legal books or in whatever books you use to measure and say that, okay, this is there. You must be deeply interested to know that if it is here, where is it not? And why is it not there if it is in the Constitution or in any other land law? But now I would like to go to Miss Lillian. And as we were discussing the question of culture with Mr. Jonathan, the question of climate change comes up. I know LandNet has done work around climate change and women's land rights and how women are disproportionately affected because of climate. And one might wonder, what is the link between equitable access to resources, climate change, then women's land rights, then gender equality? I feel LandNet and you are the person best situated to answer this. So what are those concerns in as far as climate change is concerned and women's rights are concerned? And then what is the link between those two critical words, as I may call them, and equitable access to resources? Yes, Ms. Lillian.
Thank you, Omega. Briefly, last year we had the climate week, and it was held in Nairobi. And the discussion that was there was on climate change without considering land. Land was at the center. And also at the same time, we did not feel that women were at the center of the discussion when it came to climate change. Yet we know that women play a big role when it comes to climate change. And second, land is key when it comes to issues of climate change. Land helps to address climate change. So in those discussions, when we leave out women in the discussions and also leave out land, that therefore hinders our efforts to address climate change. And those are issues that different partners, international organizations are trying to bring it onto board, that in order for us to address climate change, land is key. And if land is key, because we know that the predominant users of land are women. And when they use this land, they are the ones who provide the food basket. For example, in Uganda, they are the ones who do most of that work and provide the food that we eat. So when we leave out those two factors, meaning we are not actually deliberate on curbing on climate change. So basically, that is the relationship between climate change, land, and gender. Because at the end of the day, at the center of climate change, you see that women are on this side and land is on the other side.
Oh yeah, and thank you so much. For me, as you were giving your presentation, just two words came to me when you spoke about the food basket. And all through the webinar, we keep hearing words like agrarian society, that women own 27% of land, and yet they produce 70% of what? Of food crops. And climate change and land and equitable access to resources in this particular case, which is land, gender sensitive land governance and rights, they're so deeply interconnected, because women, like we said, they're tilling this land, right? So they will have a different vulnerability when these climate change issues heat. So for instance, if there is soil erosion and your husband has gone to, he's riding a boda and you cannot ride a boda because you're a woman, because women are not supposed to drive bodas, and you're restricted to tilling your land as your way of sustenance, not only to eat food, but to send your children to school. When there is any form of climate change in the world, your vulnerability is much more different. And so that food basket, like you keep making reference to it's climate change is not something that is far from us. It is something that actually we must take cognizance of in as far as women's rights are concerned. So that vulnerability when it comes to agricultural production and all that. And as we go into the next question, which will be led by Mr. Jonathan, maybe Mr. Jonathan, you can also add on to something relating to climate change. I know you've done extensive work on this. Hello, we can't hear you.
No, in the context of climate change, I think Lillian, has articulated the core issues. Climate change is fundamentally a land use problem. It amazes me when people go for these discussions and sort of this limited focus on the land use, the land dimension to climate change. It's quite a funny situation. Now, women are the predominant users of land, and I think that is true for most parts of Africa. So if climate change is a land use issue that I think we all agree, it then basically matters that those that are at the forefront of land use are equipped with this information, but also more importantly, have stronger, have security over that they call their land. Because then if you are insecure on your land, what are the chances that you will engage in responsible land use practices? Chances are you'll be more keen on intensifying use of, say, chemicals, so to get maximum yield, because you're not sure if by the time you harvest, the land still belongs to you. So it therefore matters that women's land are strengthened, because it has a very, very primary school, basic primary school linkage to the climate crisis that we are dealing with as a country. Of course, there are bigger players in terms of climate change that are contributing to, the greenhouse emissions and everything. But in our small scale way as well, it is critical that women are secured, because when their land rights are secured, then they're in a better place to engage in responsible land use. That's a little that I could add on that topic.
Yes, and thank you so much. And you've really articulated that the threat is now not only culture, it is not only gender equality, it is not only repressive laws, but climate change is a real threat to the key segment of the population that is tilling this land, or for whom this resource means a chance at a better life, at education. So it is something that we must take extremely seriously. It is something that, as we look at land as a comprehensive resource and something that women should own, it is something that has to be factored in. During Climate Week, there must be deep, intricate conversations on land, and vice versa. During Land Week, the same, even during community sensitizations, to break it down for communities down there, to understand that things such as pollution, they will affect the different genders in different ways because of how those genders relate with that particular resource. So yeah, that is it. And I think you cannot have a question of challenges without having a question of remedies. It is just the next question. So this particular time we can tilt it around, and Miss Lillian can come first. So we know what the challenges are from this particular conversation. And as lawyers here at FIDA Uganda, and as the brilliant minds at Landnet, and everyone on the call, I see so many people on the call, Stella, Joanna, Mito, we have mentees here at FIDA Uganda that are on this particular call. We have people from all walks of life. what are the remedies to this particular issue of inequitable access to resources in as far as women are concerned. And even as Jonathan and Lillian share with us these remedies, at which levels are these remedies? Do we have these remedies at government? And what can these people in this particular core and whatever institutions they represent, where do they sit in ensuring that there is equitable access to resources? Yes, Ms. Lillian, you can come in first.
Thank you, Omega. Some of the remedies that we could employ is currently we have the legal aid bill that hasn't yet been passed, that is still at Parliament. And the legal aid bill helps the women to access justice at a lower cost compared to the courts. And we know that the women at times do not have that financial muscle to go to the courts. And some of them are not economically empowered and they're dependent on the men for financial, whatever it is. So one of that is making sure that we have that brought onto board, passed and made into law, that will help us help the women access legal services, because the legal services are really key to them, and they should be actually free to the woman. Yeah. Then secondly, when we look at still under access to justice, when you look at the traditional leaders, we see the traditional leaders trying to resolve conflicts in the communities. But the challenge that comes in is that we have the informal structure, then the informal structure. So if we could have that linkage between the two, the informal and the formal, that when a dispute is resolved by the traditional leaders, and we assume that now that we have empowered the traditional leaders, the gender responsive, so that a decision that is made during alternative dispute resolution by the traditional leaders is effective. So that also helps the woman to get justice. Then let's look at Jonah spoke about the third of women representing in the land administration structures, district land board, local council, area land committees, and the women are not really empowered to take up those positions. And I know that there are organizations that are building the capacity and empowering women to take up those positions. Let it be even political or what. So that is one other way that we could ensure that we front women that are able to articulate issues that are affecting them. And once they do that, we'll be able to achieve our goal as women.
Thank you so much.
I think basically those are the few. Maybe Jonah can add more redresses that we can look at here.
Yes, Mr. Jonathan, you can add on to this.
Yeah, thank you. I think Lillian has touched on the key long-term measures that I think we can put in place to remedy the situation. We are talking about access to remedies. So remedies essentially about pursuing justice. So if you have progressive legislation that supports provision of legal aid services, that would be a good stepping stone. But of course, experience in the land sector has shown us that near having good laws that we, like we talked about in the earlier parts of this conversation, is not an end of itself. So we can get the legal aid bill passed, which would be a good move. But you and I know that there's that requirement for certificate of financial implication. And so even if we go through everything and get passed, but we know that that requirement means that government is committing to finance it. And I think we have lived long enough to know that this is not the most, I don't want to make this a political rally, but like this is not the most, the best government in terms of fulfilling some of the commitment that it makes in the law. So I think we need to also focus on small, quick wins that probably have little financial implications. So for example, let's think about, I mentioned the issue of if we want to make the thing a reality, do we have the infrastructure for it? So something as basic as, you see how they manage to link the passport to the national ID. So basically now, you literally can't get a passport if you don't have a national ID. So can you have something like that tagged onto for the property registry, so that then you know by just a click of a mouse, you can cross-check information if somebody is married or not, and if they are married and they're transacting on a property, does it fall under family, land, does it require consent, so that the person providing the service on the government end doesn't have to start making frantic phone calls, look for an LC, look for your girlfriend or your whatever to verify this information. So that is something that I don't think requires a lot of money, honestly, because it's about integrating systems. For me, that is a quick remedy that can deal with some of these issues in the long run. The other is that as people in the land sector and as lawyers, oftentimes people think quickly, oh, I have the matter, go to court. But oftentimes people have not also exhausted the rather the administrative process. So for example, how often have we advised our clients to pursue remedies with the register of titles? Some things could require as small as, at LDC we call them love letters, a formal letter raising a particular issue and seeking for action from a commissioner within a ministry or from a minister of land, maybe commissioner of land registration or things like that. There are those small actions that we can take that go a long way in probably curtailing an injustice from happening at a very minimal cost. And then also thinking of, in terms of the work that we do, the likes of FIDA, Landless, TI, and all this, organization. I think when you're pushing for land rights, women's land rights, we need to go beyond narrating the law. I've done many community outreaches. I've attended those done by other people. We go there to our community in Karamoja and we're obsessing ourselves with legalese. Section this, article this, blah, 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 blah. That is important information, true, but I think we need to move the discussion further to actually make arguments beyond the law. So for example, has anyone done a study that can make very strong economic arguments in support of women's land rights, so that when I'm speaking to a person deep down in the rural community, I am not just telling them that there's this law introduced by the white people that we are using now to tell you to do this, but I tell them, no, when we have stronger women's land rights, these are the benefits that we anticipate or that come with it. Economically, one of the arguments has always been that women's land rights have strong spillover effects because women look after the vulnerable in the community. They provide for issues to do with food and things like that in the household. So we need to show messages that don't show us to be coming from a begging position, like we are begging you to do this to change, to show them that you're actually missing a lot by not supporting by not supporting women's rights. There's more that you could have benefited as a community, as a family, if your women were empowered at strong learners. So I think there are these small, doesn't require strong financial implication. It could be just rearranging the messaging that we have now, playing with the resources that we have, and get the same product. And of course, finally, on this, when it's not realistic to reduce our work to small campaigns, 1 year, 3 years, projects here and there. You talk about social and cultural transformation. These are long-term battles. You're going to deal with a person who is 40 years, who for the last 40 years has held the view that this is how things are done in our community. And then you're coming with your 1 year, 2 year project to think that you're going to switch their mind that easily. So thinking long-term investments, and these are conversations we need to have with our donors, even government, having sustained efforts. Right now, government has been busy for the last few years doing, we're issuing certificates of customer ownership across the country, very excellent. They're issuing certificates of occupancy, those ones you're talking about at the start of the show, very good. But those are project-based interventions. You cannot find it in the national budget. The government of Uganda has said for the next 10 years, we'll be giving out 5,000 certificates to women or to husbands and wives for the next 10 years. I mean, I've not looked at the budget, but chances are you may not find such measures. So if we reduce this thing to short term, subject to availability of funds, 1 year, 2 years, I think we'll not be making a lot of progress that we ought to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. As you were presenting, I just kept thinking to myself, Ms. Lillian has ushered us into a very deep end, into the deep end of the pool, which is access to justice in this particular topic, equitable access to resources. So do you have the equitable access to justice to get your resources? Because if we are discussing as a key remedy that we are looking at, we are saying the legal aid bill is something that we should push for, we should make sure that we have, so that at least there is some form of what is it called? Of free access to justice. If there is no access to justice that is free, at least at a subsidized cost. So much later on, I'm very excited to hear from our participants in the chat room on exactly what Mr. Jonathan has brought out on that question of the financial implication of the of the National Legal Aid Bill, and what does subsidization look like? If it being free is not possible, what does subsidization look like? But again, just to touch on that whole concept of the legal aid bill and why it matters on equitable access to resources, it is very, very plain. If you have a national legal aid law that is offering free legal aid, or at least legal aid at a subsidized cost, then you will have women claim their property or enforce their rights through the right ways. And maybe just our time is fast spent, but I can just make reference to a small piece of information. HIL, the Hague Institute of Legal Innovation, they released the Justice Needs and Satisfaction Survey, this 2024. And for me, as we have this discussion, it's one that is really, it fits in so well, because they say when they did the research, the most common sources of help for people, direct negotiation was at 25%. So as a woman who is seeking to enforce equitable access to resources, how equal is the playing field for you to say you're going to have direct negotiation with a perpetrator? Getting help from a family member was at 47%. So if your family member is your perpetrator, is the help they're going to give you helpful? Really? The local council courts, it was at 24%. And as we read these sources of help, they're actually ranked in, what is it called? In hierarchy. But it is direct negotiation first, the family member, the local council court at 24% or 27%. You have the police at 21%. Even with the police, you have to ask yourself, are they properly trained that if a woman went there to make a claim or to enforce a right that deals with equitable access to resources, and this is really for government and for CSOs to train the police where necessary to advocate for this. Shockingly, after the police is a friend, and a friend was at 20%. So if your friend does not have any knowledge on legal matters, you are actually with an enemy, quote unquote. Next was a cultural and traditional leader at 17%. And this webinar is clearly showing you that we are dealing with cultural norms, but in the hierarchy of where people go to seek help or access to justice, for them to have equitable access to their resources, there are cultural leaders in the mix there. Then you have to ask yourself, are these cultural leaders empowered enough to help these people? Do they have the knowledge? Then you have a formal court at just 6%, right? So how important is this national legal aid bill if we are just 6% as a source of help? And this is without even saying how many cases, how much case backlog is there with that 6%, right? So we are in such a, I have no word for it. Still, we continue. There is a neighbor at 11%. Then there is a lawyer at 4%. So again, those questions of who can access a lawyer, how much is a lawyer, they come into play. Are you well educated to even know that there are lawyers in place? And then there is a colleague at 6%. So the question of the National Legal Aid Bill is one that is not only timely, it's extremely important. And for our participants in the chat room, the entire webinar is keen to hear your thoughts on it, on the price of it. Yeah. So we go into our last question for our esteemed panelists, and it is really a simple one. The question of urgency. What is at the top of your list? What is the urgent action that we can take as civil society organizations to complement the government effort? The government has its effort, and it is a very beautiful effort, and it is helping in as much as it can. But as practitioners in this field, what is at the top of your list? What is that issue of urgency that you feel each civil society organization must have at the top to ensure that there is equitable access to resources? So, Ms. Jonathan, you can go first.
Right. Thank you, Omega. On the issue of urgent actions, I think I could have touched on them a little bit in my previous submission. But I think if we're looking at issues to do with succession and inheritance, you have the Act now amended, a few gains made there, like Lillian articulated, but I think now we need to get the regulations. I don't know how far that has gone, so I think that would be a quick advocacy area so that we sort of try to deal with issues related to around inheritance and have, well elaborated guidelines that regulations always provide. So that will help to operationalize the Act. And I think the FIDA learned, that is your forte. You guys are good with that kind of advocacy. If you talk about women's land rights, we've honestly come a long way. I think that while we might, paint a gloomy picture, I think the milestone that we've highlighted since the start of this call are something worth celebrating. But I think that as FIDA and as land actors of the country, one of the things you need to do is to, I remember some time back, last minute did something around the cost-benefit analysis of the legal aid policy, yes. And they actually tried to do a bit of mathematics here and there, got a bit of economic modeling to try to estimate how much it would cost to do that. And I think we need something similar for women's land rights, because if we are to go beyond urging the legalese of this issue, we also need to show the mathematics of it, that actually this is what the country is missing because women have weak land rights. And there's a very interesting campaign going on. I think you guys are part of the Stand for Our Land campaign. These are some of the ideas, if you look at the campaign strategy, these are some of the ideas that are flagged off there. And I think that with this, if you combine the legal thinking within FIDA, partner with a little bit of people who look at things from an economic angle, and organizations like Go Back and Learn It, you should be in position to put together a groundbreaking piece of work that can actually show that if we pursue this issue to its logical conclusion, these are the gains that we start to make as a country in terms of agricultural productivity. What does that mean? That means this food security and everything, and broader, contribution to the economic progress of the country. And yes, we talked about the legal aid argument, and I'm glad that you flagged off sort of some of the challenges that come with that. But I think it is a gospel that we're not going to tire from preaching, because to be fair, I think that I would rather have a law which is not enforced than not have a law at all. Because tomorrow, when you get serious guys in power, maybe they will pick up the things and enforce them. So I think that while it is frustrating to enforce these laws, it should not dissuade us from actually ensuring that we have good laws, because that time will come when probably someone who thinks of these issues more seriously will prioritize them over buying tear gas and we focus on the things that matter as a country. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, so much for your comments and tear gas comments. But now back to you, Ms. Lillian. What is at the top of your list? What must CSOs prioritize?
I think, thank you, Omega. Some of the issues, John has raised them. Basically, I had four issues, and one of them is if we could have deliberate implementation of the laws, that would do well for the women. Then I also had another issue on data collection. When we do data collection in regards to mainland rights and all that, it helps us on our advocacy. We do not have clear statistics on how many women have owned land. We keep quoting old statistics, yet data is very critical when it comes to advocacy. So if we could do that, and also that helps us to know where we have come from and where we are heading to. Not us to generally speak that, okay, because you have seen people issuing out CCOs and all the women are getting CCOs. Oh, majority of the women are getting CCOs. No, it could be a small percentage that are really getting the CCOs and having their names there. Then when it comes to the norms and the customs that are deep-rooted in our societies, I think we should employ approaches of gender transformative approaches, enable us tackle that, because that's something that can't be done in 1 year, in 2 years, but it's something that we could start applying into our work to ensure that we're able to break into that deep root causes that are causing gender inequality. Then lastly, I had a point on economic empowerment. Economic empowerment, when you empower a woman economically, there are so many issues that get resolved in that angle of being economically empowered. One, employment, the woman will be employed. She'll be able to provide for her family. It will reduce domestic violence. Sexual harassment will be reduced. So for me, those are some of the issues that civil society should work on. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The saying was that caring is sharing, sharing is caring. In this case, it's sharing is caring. Thank you to our panelists for taking the time to be with us. And at this point, allow me to open the floor to everyone that has been gracious to join this particular webinar. If you have a question, if you have a comment, we already have a question, comment on the National Legal Aid Bill. Feel free, type in the chat, raise your hand, and the floor is open. Yes. Anyone with a comment or a question for the panelists?
Doreen's hand is up. I think Doreen Kisache.
Yes, Doreen, you can unmute yourself and speak. Hello, Doreen. I think we have missed you, but if you can still hear us, you can just unmute yourself and speak. All right, then. So we are well within our time. We were scheduled to close at exactly 4. And thank you to everyone that has made time to attend this particular meeting. Please make use of FIDA Uganda resources and even LandNet resources. Our resources as FIDA Uganda free. So if it is legal representation, kindly just go to our website in whatever area that you're in. We are in 21 districts. Check your area, call the toll-free lines, leave a message, whether it is equitable access to resources, whether it is domestic violence, gender inequality. We are here to promote the rights of women in Uganda and to transform society using the law. Make use of other FIDA Uganda resources such as the Leadership Academy. Under the Leadership Academy, we have so many trainings. We have CLE trainings, we have the coffee series, we have all those trainings that are there for you to learn and grow with us. And lastly, for everyone on the call, circulate as much as possible that we have a mentorship program that is opening and running here at FIDA Uganda. We like to say, come and learn from the best. So we will pair you with key influential, key dedicated, key committed women's rights activists and women that are really changing the country for the better, whether it is through the law, whether it is through social activism. Sign up for our mentorship program. If you need more details, kindly go to our website and see who to contact, see how you can be a part of this. Let's learn, let's share together. Thank you to everyone who has joined our call. These webinars, 2 of them, there was one before this, are in preparation for our National Gender Forum. And in this particular webinar, we looked at targets, this particular target. But during the National Gender Forum, we shall look at that particular SDG 5 and how are we doing as a country. So moving away from equitable access to resources, but just looking at it in its full comprehensive nature. And we shall have very many panelists, very many sessions. So please do not miss that. You may not be able to physically attend it, but we shall have live coverage of the events. Go to our social media pages, keep an eye there. Yeah, and that is it. Let me check the chat if there is any feedback. In the chat, we have Doreen Chisache. She says, I think yesterday's budget speech from a high-level government official, the Minister of Finance and Planning, particularly clause 139 of his speech, acknowledges that women, mothers of this nation, have been sidelined in this country. She continues, praising yoga, PDM, and other forms of wealth creation would be fine if there were no economic disparities. Look at this, exempting investors from tax capital gains, from the sale of holdings, private equity, and then go on to increase excise duty, petrol and diesel by 100 shillings. Have we considered women in agricultural businesses who are to suffer such transport costs in business? Then we have Miss Lucy Ladira, who says, thank you, FIDA, for having these young people on board. The views are so refreshing and they are very well prepared for the webinar. Jonathan has done a very good job. Thank you, Omega, for the awesome moderation. Thank you, Miss Lucy Ladira, for the very kind comments. We have Doreen, who says that, dear fellow SDG 5 advocates, I think from this webinar, let us label ourselves the SDG 5 advocates. Let's try to analyze these key aspects. The Sexual Offences Bill pending, the National Legal Aid Bill, 3 teary emojis, the Employment Amendment Bill of 2022. We have Ms. Deborah Okia, who says that, I totally agree with Jonathan on changing the strategies in terms of the kind of empowerment within the community levels. It is no longer feasible to just speak to laws, but rather the actual initiatives and actual action plans to be engaged to push for results. And finally, Mr. Jonathan Ochom says that, thanks for the feedback, Doreen and Deborah. Stella Kitui has just come in right now, and she says that the adoption of gender transformative approaches that aim to tackle structural and root causes of the issues that affect women's enjoyment of resources, especially land. So we should pay attention to these gender transformative approaches. So thank you everyone who has contributed immensely to this conversation, whether it has been through the chat, whether it has been through active listening, and to our dear panelists, thank you so much for sparing your time, for sparing your resources, and most especially for sparing your knowledge and sharing it with the people on this call. Please always be on the lookout for informative learning engagements from FIDA Uganda and from LandNet and all other partners on this call. Thank you for joining us. We have 4 more minutes to spare, but we've come to the end as very good timekeepers. Have a very nice evening. Okay. Bye-bye.